Hello, this is Elsa, and I am delighted to have with me today Laura Knight-Jadczyk, who has pursued truth basically all her life. And it's led to more than a dozen books. I don't know, what is it, 22, 30?
I think it's 16 right now.
Okay, 16. An incredible outpouring. And my interest is, where did it start, as well as how did she develop? So I want to start with you, Laura, not with all your achievements, but with you as a child. What were you like? What was your environment like? Since you've done so much writing, I'm going to presume you were a reader. What were you reading and what else was going on with you?
Well, nice to be with you, and I'll try to answer that question as concisely as possible since it's a multi-part question. Um, as a child, I would say I was fairly normal, a small child, and then I became less normal as I grew older. I think that was due to events in my life, family situation, and so forth. And as a result of that, I became quite withdrawn. And as I grew older, I became socially retarded. And I retreated into books. And I was such a reader. I would read under the covers with a flashlight. I would read in classroom, hide my book that I'm reading within the textbook, hold it like this so that nobody would know that I was reading something else. And I would read when I was walking home from school. I'd read at the table. I had the book with me all the time, whatever book it was. I was a reader. And that's pretty much all I can really, tell you. I mean, I've gone into some fairly exquisite detail in one of my books of, how things were when I was growing up, and the various reasons for why I became the way I became. But how much of it was genetic, I don't know. My brother is very similar, even though we have, in a sense, somewhat different personalities. He is way more antisocial than I am. And he talks way less than I do. And he reads different things, but he reads all the time. And so, I'd say part of it was genetic, part of it was upbringing, and the kinds of books I read. Well, as a small child, I can't really tell you. I remember the first book I read of a book that was like a real book, not a child's book, not see the ball, see Jack, see Jane throw the ball, see the dog, etc. But the first real book I remember was entitled Rusty, a Cocker Spaniel. And it was a full story about a little dog named Rusty, and I guess it was along the lines of Lassie, the little dog that was heroic and so forth. And that was probably in first or second grade because I learned to read when I was about 3, and I kind of taught myself. But then the first book that had a real serious impact on me, following, basically childhood reading, and when we were talking earlier, you mentioned reading about Clara Barton and Florence Nightingale. So did I. I read about them, and I read about the lady who started the Girl Scouts and the man who started Boy Scouts, and I thought they were heroic. I was born on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, so of course I had books about Abraham Lincoln that were given to me fairly regularly, so he was kind of a hero. And one of the important ones from that period was a book about George Washington Carver. Did you know he invented peanut butter?
Yes. Yes.
So I read about George Washington Carver, and I just, that was one of my favorite books that stuck in my mind forever, the things that he went through. I think he was a child of slaves, and he grew up in the most horrible conditions of deprivation, and that affected me very profoundly as a small child. So uh, then the one that really hit me hard, I was 11 years old, and there was a shed on the property where our farm was, and there was boxes of books in there that belonged to my aunt, uh, who lived far away, and these were hers from when she was young. And in that box of book was one called The Story of a Secret State by Jan Karski, The Resistance in Poland during World War II. And I was so, I was devastated because here I was, 11 years old. It was, a long time after the war. People didn't really talk about the war when I was growing up, even though my father, both my uncles, were in the war, and my uncle was affected by it for the rest of his life. But reading about World War II was a profound experience, and along with earlier questions that had developed in my mind about good and evil, I thought about good and evil when I was like 4 years old, was that how could something like that happen? How could people behave that way? I couldn't grasp it. My 11-year-old mind just couldn't go there. And it became kind of an obsession of mine to learn everything I could about World War II and try to understand how it happened, what kind of people did things like that. And that started one thread of my investigations for pretty much the rest of my life, which is human psychology, social behavior, anthropology, that sort of thing. And it's not lost on me, of course, that I ended up marrying a Polish physicist. So I was very, very impressed by the ingenuity of these people under the most horrible conditions you could imagine. And more than anything, that also sort of started the real trend towards historical reading. Because if you can learn something about something that was just X number of years ago, just not that many years ago, you can learn about things that were even further back and further back. So I became a history buff. And from then on, I was reading history, and I would read diaries, and I would read, accounts of all kinds of events. I did at some point read historical novels, but I was kind of a picky about them because once I had read the documented facts about historical events, if somebody was writing a historical novel and they didn't, kind of stick to the facts as they were known, I would get very irritated, and I would, that author would be blackballed. But historical novels that were written by an author who was well educated and knew how to use the actual data and weave the story well, I really like those.
I have a question. Are you still talking about your childhood and your teen years? Because I
Yeah.
know at some point you got married quite early and had 5 children. So
Well,
is this
yeah,
continuing in your marriage, or did you take a break?
this is all through my growing up years. Then I went to college and I studied. I majored in the sciences, biological sciences, anatomy and physiology, that sort of thing. And I went to nursing school, and I got pregnant at the age of 26. So I wasn't or at the age of 25, I had the baby at 26. So it wasn't really that early. And but up to that point in time, I had read, I read continuously history. But there was another phase in my growing up years when I was about 13. My brother met an old gentleman because he was cutting his grass and delivering things for him. And this guy had the entire collection of all of the reports from the Society of Psychical Research from England from back in the 19th, early 20th century. And I began to read all those. He also had books about all kinds of magic, shamanism, all kinds of ghost stories and that sort of thing. And I was just absolutely fascinated because, in a sense, that's kind of historical too. Anything that talks about things that happened from old times or anything like that interested me. So I was reading that. So that kind of went in, dovetailed into my interest in human psychology, because human psychology along the lines of good and evil, and then, the deeper psychology of the spirit that kind of went in with that, and history, which is, how things came to be the way they are today, which is based on how they were before. It's really true that if you don't know history, you don't know where you are, and you don't know what's going to happen, because history really does, in a sense, repeat itself. Not exactly every time. It's more like a spiral than an absolute circle that goes around and around. It spirals. And then, of course, I got into the sciences, and then when I had my first child, obviously I had to get a real job. And, I wasn't really qualified for anything. I had taken art classes and, little fun things alongside with my biology and psychological sciences and that sort of thing. So I wasn't really qualified for anything. So I ended up getting a job working for the state of Florida. And I worked as a welfare certifier, for food stamps and so forth. And I spent my days talking to people in hard conditions all day long. And I was really extremely sympathetic to their plight because, it was my job for them to tell me their story so that I could decide, what to do in their case, who to refer them to, what to give them. And this also kind of coincided with the change between the Reagan and the Carter administrations. And I observed what happened when administrations changed when you're working in a government office. Before you have a manual that tells you how to handle cases, how to dot the I's and cross the T's. And it's, about this thick. And then the new administration issues a new one. And I realized that, a presidential administration can have a profound effect on, federal government or state government offices, especially if it was a state government office, but it was, funded largely by the federal government. So the federal government had a lot to say about, how things were done. And the two views, the Carter administration view and the Reagan administration view. And that was, I learned a lot from that because neither view, in my opinion, was exactly appropriate to the situation. The Reagan administration expected everybody to be a fraud and expected all of them to be, pulling one over. And there was a lot of talk and protection against, fraud. And I didn't see that fraud happening, really. I saw people who were being, overburdened with the paperwork, the details of having to prove their existence so that they could get, like 10 cents worth of help. That really frustrated me. Maybe not quite that bad, but it was frustrating. And then Carter comes along and just gives it away without any evidence at all. So it was true. That was what was happening. They could come in, they could tell you their situation, and you were required to give them the maximum that they were allowed to receive for a 3-month period before requiring a stitch of evidence. So for 3 months, they could have everything. Just boom. No, they could come in with nothing but an ID. And in fact, in some cases, they didn't even have to have ID. If they came in and said, I'm so-and-so and my ID was stolen, you still had to give them stuff. So that wasn't very satisfactory either, but I learned a lot from that. But then going along, my children are being born. I'm living with my ex-husband, taking care of my grandmother who died, uh, taking care of my mother, all kinds of things going on, but I'm still reading. I still manage to read. I mean, even if I had to have a book sitting there while I was cooking dinner, if I had a few minutes between having to stir something or put it in or take it out of the oven, I was reading. I would read in the bathtub. I would read when the kids were down for a nap. I mean, you just name any kind of 10 minutes I could snatch in it. And I was a speed reader. I mean, when I was in 7th grade, we had an English teacher who was very taken with speed reading. John Kennedy could speed read, so, it was the thing. So he had the machine that helped everyone to learn to speed read, and we all became speed readers. So I can speed read like crazy. I can read an entire book, a fairly good sized book in a day, and small ones I can read 2 or 3 in a day. If I'm really focused on that. And I remember almost everything I read. I mean, for years and years. I mean, I can remember. It's just my memory is probably my greatest blessing and my greatest curse, because not only do I read and remember things, but I also remember my life. And of course, anybody who's lived a life and they're 70 years old, as I am, has regrets that you cannot forget. So, it's a blessing and it's a curse. It helps me in my work, but oh boy. Anyway, at some point, my ex-husband had a friend whose father was a retired Army major. He died. And his friend came to our house with a big trunk load of books and said, "I know your wife's a reader. Maybe she'd like these." So we went through the trunk full of books, and there was one in there called "None Dare to Call It Conspiracy" by Gary Allen. And I read it, and I was just absolutely stunned. I was devastated, because I was, pretty good patriotic type of person, and I, believed in all of the high ideals of love, honor, justice, country. Abraham Lincoln, for God's sakes, I mean, I was born on his birthday. So I was, and also I'm descended from 4 or 5 lines of Jamestown settlers. So my people were here before the Plymouth Rock came along. So I think the earliest was 1630. So, yeah. So this really devastated me. And basically what it talked about was war as a racket, war as a means of redistributing global power, money, all kinds of nefarious purposes, and politics is just the facade that covers up the creation and the pursuit of war, and, death and assassination. So, of course, this horrified me, and I just couldn't believe that something that, for example, the claim that the United States more or less provoked their own entry into World War II by manipulating the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor. That's a pretty horrible thing to say that somebody was manipulated and that there were diplomatic things going back and forth that caused this event to happen, when so many innocent American servicemen were killed in that event. And then all the many that were killed in the war itself, that followed. And that, of course, was the thing that Pearl Harbor was why the U.S. entered World War II. So when somebody says, a new Pearl Harbor, I know exactly what they mean. It means manipulated. I mean, that's immediately what comes to mind. But anyway, it was horrible, and it was just as horrible as trying to figure out why the Nazis did what they did, and all about World War II, and the whole thing, going back to the book I read when I was 11 years old. So the interest in politics kind of really grew in there. So I'm reading all the time: history, psychology, biology, and sciences, and you know, political history and that sort of thing, and and a lot of psychic stuff, because of course the psychic stuff really interested me, because back up again, when I was in college, I trained to do hypnotherapy. And I was doing this all along in the background throughout the years when, people knew I was a hypnotherapist, and they would come to me and they would ask for a session. Usually it was, stress reduction, try to stop smoking, lose weight, so on and so forth. But there was enough of people wanting past life regressions and that sort of thing that I did quite a bit of that. And then I read a book. I mean, this story is a lot more detailed, but I'm just giving you the highlights. I read a book about spirit attachment, what we would call possession. And it basically taught techniques, and many of them were somewhat familiar to me just from doing basic hypnotherapy. And I thought, well, let me try this. I'll start asking this series of questions to some of my people. When I get somebody in, I'll ask them these questions, see if this guy is telling the truth. Because I mean, it was so shocking for somebody to say that nearly everyone has an attached spirit, or two, or three, or four, or five, or six, or more. And so so there's a set of questions you ask, and they're really non-leading, and if you don't know what it's about, you won't know what they mean. So I started doing that, and lo and behold, geez, he was right. Good Lord, there's a bus load with nobody driving. And learning how spirit attachments could influence people to do things, to marry people, to influence them to, choose a profession, to do all kinds of things. And of course, once you learn something like this, you start looking back over your own life and you say, well, was I influenced to do this, that, or the other thing? Was there ever a point, etc. But all of that goes along until... And throughout these years, I also had several severe accidents. I had a couple of auto accidents, and one was very early on. I think I was like 22 or 23, and I was thrown from the vehicle up against a telephone pole and injured my back. And that's given me trouble, for all my life. And other back injuries, and then I had some injuries while I was married to my ex-husband, and it all culminated in a final accident in 1994, and on Christmas Eve, in fact. And I spent a couple of years in therapy just being able to, walk properly and dress myself again. Because I literally, I couldn't bend, move, lift my legs, do these kind of things. Getting in and out of the bathtub was a production. Getting up and down off the toilet was a production. And throughout that time, it became more and more apparent to me that I was more of a housekeeper, watcher of the children, do all these other kind of things, kind of a servant to my ex-husband, than I was somebody to be cared for and cherished while I was in an injured state. And so I ended my marriage, and that was in 1996. So, and then I ended my marriage in March, and I met my present husband in July. So, it wasn't I wasn't dangling out there hanging in the wind for very long. But during the course of this living, this life, there was also what we call the Cassiopaean experiment. And that came as a result of my researches into psychic phenomena, what was really true, what wasn't true, examining the case histories, things like William Crookes and Daniel Dunglass Home and the Fox sisters and, all the old ones. And then, of course, I went through all of these, I had gone through all of these reports from the SPR. And then there was this burgeoning activity around me in books and workshops and meetings and so forth with all this new channeling stuff. I mean, this channeling was going on, and I was reading these books, and I'd read them, and some of them were so silly, and some of them were so illogical, and some of them were really compelling. But is this true? I mean, being able to determine something, whether something is or isn't true in our reality, in our world, is difficult enough when you have people who lie and conceal and hide things. Things like the political situation causes World War II, and then somebody comes along and reveals documents that suggest that it was completely different from what you'd been told, and you realize that the truth was something else. Truth was a really important subject here. And, the truth of World War II, the truth of politics, the truth of what was really going on with these poor people getting food stamps versus, vis-a-vis the Reagan administration and the Carter administration. Who's telling the truth about them? Give them everything or torture them until they bleed to get anything. It was really crazy. And now all of a sudden, there's all this channeled material. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I had to read it, of course. I mean, this is what happens to me is a topic attracts my interest, and I have to read everything because I know, based on experience, that there might be something you don't read that has that piece of evidence, like diplomats triggering Pearl Harbor, that you didn't have, and you might believe all of this big story, and it might all be false. Somewhere there might be a clue. So, of course, I read and read and read and read, and I compared what I was reading and to what I had read so many years before that were fairly well documented, the SPR cases, and there were many, many cases of many types of phenomena, not necessarily channeling the way it was being done at this point in time. People were just sitting down and putting pyramids on their heads and saying, hi, I'm Lord so-and-so from the Galactic Federation, and then they're off and running. And that became a real point of interest to me. And of course, I had studied at length the histories of occultism and occultists and so forth. And if you read biographies of the various individuals who claim to be a great occultist or a great psychic or medium or whatever, people like Eileen Garrett and Cassiopaea Palladino and that sort of thing, and you learn that there are certain things that you look for when you're looking at a medium, and how critical are they. And then of course there was Jane Roberts and the Seth material. Oh my God! And of course I had read all the Edgar Cayce books from years before, because that followed right after the SPR material, and so I was, my head was full of all kinds of facts and data, and I was pretty sure that a lot of what was coming down as channeled material wasn't very good, at least, and was really awful and misleading at worst. And so I thought about it, and I said, well, what I can see from the history of it is that most occultists or people who get into this type of situation, this material activity is big. They shoot like a rocket and then crash and burn, because it's like their lives end in ignominy. And that kind of troubled me a little bit, because why was it? I mean, for example, certain mediums, not all of them, there were some real respected ones that were, would cheat. If the stars were not properly aligned and they couldn't produce any phenomena, they would cheat, to try to, keep things going. And then there were occultists who got into stuff, and then they had horrible, tragic things began to happen in their lives, and everything went kaflooey, and then they died, living on the street or miserable, that sort of thing. So, and then, of course, I had something else in my bag of tricks that a lot of these people didn't have. I had this spirit release therapy that I had learned about spirit attachments and the dangers of spirit attachments. And I had, dealt with a few exorcistic type activities. And so I had that, and I thought, well, obviously, a lot of these people who are mediums or channeling are really just giving voice to an attached entity. It was fairly clear and obvious. They'd sit down there, and then kind of like dissociative identity disorder. They would just dissociate, and then their control would come through and start talking, and only it wasn't really a control. It was an attached entity of some sort that was feeding off of them, basically, and using their sensorium to interact with the three-dimensional world. So that was a little bit problematic, and I really gave that a lot of thought. And I didn't see at that point in time that there was really a really safe way to do that, because at that point, once I understood about attached entities and had interacted with some of them through, doing hypnotherapy, you could almost say, if it weren't for certain other little bits of evidence, that just about anything that came across as psychic phenomena or, channeling or anything like that was due to attachment of other entities to a living human being and using their energy and their sensorium. But there were cases that didn't really cover. So, but a lot of it did cover. And then there was the problem with most of this channeling, or a lot of it, that it started to be from aliens. And when they started talking about channeling aliens, that's where I hit my limit. That was, no, that's the line we don't cross. Because as far as I was concerned, the belief in aliens was probably just a cover for somebody being molested as a child, and they had to cover it over with something exciting and novel in order to be able to deal with the horror of what had happened to them. And belief in aliens coming to save us was what I called a millennial disease. It was just an artifact of people's brains. They felt so helpless in the face of this world in which we live because they were surrounded by lies. By this time, I knew that. And so they have to believe in something that's going to save them because they can't get out of it, And of course, they've been indoctrinated from birth to have a parental type federal government telling them what to do and where to do and how to do and so on. And so we were just in a mess, and I called it the millennial disease, the belief in aliens and the belief that aliens were going to save them. And then, of course, I got sick. And it was, my stomach, my liver, or something. I don't even remember what it was. But I had to stay in bed. And a friend of mine who'd been talking to me about aliens, and I just kept telling him nonsense. And this had been going on for a couple of years, and he was quite a bit younger than me, so he really from a different generation. And I gave him all the arguments about why it couldn't be, and then he said, blah, 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 you haven't researched it, you haven't read about it. And well, this was true, because that was on the other side of that line. And so, being sick, he brought me this paper bag and grocery sack full of these books about aliens, alien abductions, UFO sightings, all kinds of things like that. And being stuck in the bed and not having anything else available that I hadn't read, because if it was in my house, I'd read it, I picked one up and I started reading, and it was like Bud Hopkins, and then Jacques Vallée, and then, a few others. I mean, I've probably got at this point in time, I've probably got every UFO, alien abduction, studies of the mystery and so forth in existence, and I've kept up with that library. I restock it occasionally when something new comes out, if anything new comes out. And at the end of this reading of these books, and these were mass market type books.
About what year is this? How close are you to the present?
This is probably in 1990. I hadn't.
Okay, so this is still formative years before you're doing your writing.
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
Well,
Huge formation,
actually,
huge formations.
actually, no, that's not quite true because I wrote my first book in 1985, but it was due to. I'll come back to the alien thing in a minute. Let me back up for this because in 1985, um, I had my fourth child. Yeah, fourth child. Sorry. And I was injured during the delivery, and the baby was injured also. She had broken collarbones because her shoulders were too broad, and I had, kind of been torn, ripped, in my, what do they call it? Where they separate your pelvis at the front, and everything it was just a real mess, and I couldn't even walk. And I had subscribed to the ARE library by mail service, so I was sending off the piles of books during that period. And while I was bedridden, I was reading all of these books about and I came across Velikovsky. Well, they talked about Velikovsky, and I thought, well, who is Velikovsky? And I managed to get a copy of Velikovsky, and I read Velikovsky. And the thing was being a Bible nerd from an early age and having read the Bible several times, religious background and all that. And I was realizing that what Velikovsky was describing as having happened during the Exodus, based on, the descriptions in the Exodus and all of these, catastrophic models, actually sounded exactly like what was described in the book of Revelation that was predicted for the future, the end times. Well, at that time, I hadn't gone deeply into biblical studies, so I wasn't really aware that this was a fairly standard way of approaching. The explanation was that it was a standard way of approaching catastrophic events for peoples of ancient times. They would describe it in terms of world-ending scenarios, fire falling from the sky, the earth shaking and breaking open, and so on and so forth. That was the explanation that was given. Because, clearly it wasn't happening according to, modern experts. Those things weren't happening. Those were just a hyperbole. That was the way they talked about things. If the Egyptian king was destroyed by the Hittite king, then the earth shook, fire fell from the sky, the seas flowed over the land, everything was broken and destroyed and so forth. And there's a lot of material coming out from some of these ancient writings that are about that. So the explanation of the experts is that it was hyperbole. But I was thinking about it in a much more innocent frame of reference at the time I was reading it. I said, wow, that sounds like Revelation. Jeez, And I thought, is that what Revelation is really all about? Is it predicting, a cataclysmic end of the world, similar to what Velikovsky is describing in terms of the interactions of Venus and the Earth? Oh my God, if that's what he's talking about, then, and of course it was talking about the solar system being kind of like an atom and, things moving around being like, electrons jumping in the atom and so forth. So that triggered my interest in physics. So that was another thread that got added to the mix at that point in time. And so I thought about all of these things, and the thing that started really pressing on my mind in terms of prophecy was, can prophecies be true? How can someone make a prophecy? How can you know in advance? How does that work? And can it be trusted? Is it reliable? All that sort of thing. So I began to really study more about prophecy. And that was where I was focusing while I was reading the ARE library materials during this particular illness. Around that same time, that I was really studying prophecy. It was in January, or I can't remember the exact date, but the Challenger shuttle disaster occurred. And it was in the wintertime. And I remember during the night, I had this dream. And I dreamed about a corkscrew cloud of smoke in the sky and a voice saying, "Death, they're all dead. Death, they're all dead." And I got up and I realized it was the day that the shuttle was going to go up. Now, I lived in Florida. I lived, directly across from Cape Canaveral on the west coast. But if you're looking in the right direction and something's going up in space, you can catch a glimpse of it even from that distance. It's about 90 miles. So I got the kids up with our binoculars. We all trooped out, and it's really cold, and the trees are all bare and everything. And so we're pointing our eyes in the direction. And I had the radio going inside the house, but I had it sitting by the window so we could hear it outside. Hear the launch if there was going to be a delay or something. And we listened to it all, and then all of a sudden, what I'm seeing is a big corkscrew cloud of smoke. And I just knew instantly they're all dead. If they aren't dead this instant, they are going to be dead. And that's when they started talking on the radio about something's wrong, something's happened, etc., and everything went crazy. Well, that was fodder for my mill. How can I dream about something just hours before it happens? It's a little smoky, no pun intended, in terms of the imagery, but the imagery was exact. It was a corkscrew, a funny curling cloud, and a bunch of people died. And there are other instances, during my life that I could talk about where I had, semi-prophetic dreams, but they were always so mundane that they didn't make any impact on me. I dreamed one night about seeing a dog laying in a dugout hole of sand in the ground as I was driving by, and the next day, damned if I didn't see that same dog in that dugout. What the heck? Who wants to dream about an old hound dog laying in a hole in the ground? But I did, and I saw the darn dog the next day. But anyway, that really got me going. And the fact that I could dream about something like that before it happened made me wonder if it's possible for somebody 2,000 years ago to write the book of Revelation and be making an accurate prophecy that applied to us today. And that's when it started to get weird, because I started to research all kinds of things. I started to look into physics, because Velikovsky said that the solar system was something like an atom. I wanted to know about atoms, so I started reading physics books, and I got all kinds of physics books, reading. And at this point, I was taking copious notes. I have boxes full of pages of notes, because I would ask myself a question, and at the point that I asked the question, it felt like I would have pressure on my head, like right here in my forehead, like pressing. And the ideas would start to come, and I had to write them down. And I would write them down. It was like, and I just thought I was thinking. Mm-hmm. You ask yourself a question, and then your brain, the wheels turn, and you cogitate about it, and of course that is kind of how thinking works. And you come up with answers, and you write these, and I wrote these answers down, is it, possible for this? And then I started wondering about the sun, because I needed to find a mechanism for me to understand how something like this could happen. Velikovsky had Venus. Barring the entry of another giant comet into our solar system, and that's, assuming that Venus is a giant comet, which is not, definitively proved. There's still people who say it's impossible, although there are an equal number of highly educated scientific minds who say it is possible. But I needed to understand the mechanism, because the one thing I did notice about it was, from the research, was that these things happened with alarming regularity. And I read a lot about all the different theories of what people thought, caused this regularity, Milankovitch cycles and things like that. And, precession of the equinoxes, and the relationship of the Earth to the Sun, and it's kind of like a spirographical orbit, because the orbit is not just exactly the same all the time, and it shifts and moves, and if you were to draw it each time, for each year of orbit, and make a whole series of them, it would look like one of those spirograph drawings from those little kid toy things, where you put the pencil in and you start doing it, and it makes these really complex designs. So that was, I was looking for a mechanism, and that made me start studying the sun, because I thought maybe the sun might be the mechanism, because the sun has a cycle. It has the 11-22 year cycle of sunspots, and it also periodically changes its polar orientation. It does several other things. There are a number of things, and then there is the 19-year lunar cycle, and then there is the cycle of the Earth, nodding. It has a special term for that, and so many cycles. And I was looking at all of them, trying to say, how they would intermesh and intermingle together. And so I would start asking these things, and the sun became important. And it seemed to me that what the sun was, more than anything else, was an electrical phenomenon. And later on, of course, a lot of people, at that time, there were scientists talking about it that I didn't know about, but later on it became a more popular topic of discussion amongst people like you and me, instead of people in the hallowed halls of science. So I put all of this together, and I was asking myself questions and writing, and asking myself questions and writing, and asking myself questions and writing. And I ended up with a manuscript, and I call it the Noah Syndrome. And it was largely biblically based, but there was a lot of, like, Edgar Cayce and discussion of prophecy and science and atoms and da-da-da-da-da. And it was unpublished until probably about 10 years ago. I mean, I held on to this thing for a long time, because I didn't know how to get a book published. And I tried to get an agent, and they basically told me it was unpublishable, and it was actually really kind of an interesting little book for an absolute novice, absolute. And I learned to type while I was writing it, and I learned it on an old Underwood manual. I mean, the kind that had the big boxy shape and all the keys were sticking out bare, with all the under part of them, exposed. And I learned to type on that thing, and let me tell you, that'll give you some muscles in your fingers. So, that was my first book and my first experience with publishing. And since I was told it was unpublishable, I just put it in a box, and that was that. And all the years went by, all the other things happened, and we come back now to the point where I'm once again bedridden, and I'm reading about aliens. And I said, boy, there's a whole lot of smoke, but I can't see the fire. Because this whole situation was just too tricky. But I recognized two things about it. I recognized the psychic nature of it, because reading about this stuff was almost like reading about psychic case histories from the SPR. I mean, phenomena that could or could not be seen by one or more or all or none of certain witnesses, sounds and comings and goings. I mean, just all kinds of correspondences between the alien abduction phenomenon and the alien sighting phenomenon, even though this was going on in the sky or whatever, beaming down through their bedroom or whatever was going on. had a really strong flavor of this of psychic phenomena. It was paranormal. It was definitely paranormal. And then the second thing is I recognized the flavor of quite a number of attached entities I had encountered doing spirit release therapy, where they were really tricky and really nasty. And I said, this is not a good thing. So those were the two things I thought about. So
I want to ask another question. I know at some point all along you've been interested in evil. Now, you've just mentioned that some of these entities were nasty. One of the things that made me want to interview was that you wrote a foreword to an incredibly interesting book, Political Ponerology, on someone who really devoted his life with other people who died before the book came together on the nature of evil in politics and really looking at evil. Were you aware, and I'm not saying his name because I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Maybe you'll pronounce it for me.
Andrew Lobachevsky.
Andrei Lubachevsky.
Just pronounce like
Great.
Andrew. Yeah.
Were you aware of his work by then? I know he died in 2008, so I would like to
No.
know how did all these other things come together with this?
Okay, we're getting there.
Okay.
So the whole thing was that, and I engaged in what I called the Cassiopaean experiment, and that is described in great detail in my book, Amazing Grace. So I'm not going to go into all that detail now, but part of the process was the ability to discern, a proper communicant from one that was, parasitical or whatever. And that, this art of discernment, and I had been, unbeknownst to myself, really learning this all these years. Mm-hmm. And part of the work of spirit release therapy and other kinds of hypnotherapy was learning the ability to discern, what was the truth from what was false. Because, there are techniques when somebody comes up with some scenario in their head when they're under hypnosis and you think that they're telling you what really happened. Even that is not always the case, but there are techniques to break through those kinds of screens and see what is actually behind the event that they're describing. So, and there were so many other things going on. It's just not even possible. That's why I've got, these 16 books out there talking about it. And so time went by and the Cassiopaean experiment progressed, and then I, divorced my husband, partly because he really, really didn't like me dabbling in anything paranormal. And he created a lot of conflict because of it. And then, 4 months after he was gone, I met my current husband, and he was utterly fascinated. He'd been fascinated by the paranormal since he was a kid. He'd read all kinds of things. He read stuff I hadn't read. So, to make a long story short, we started a website, and I started publishing transcripts and articles, and started coming under attack because this Cassiopaean experiment, this so-called channeling, and I use a board. It's not a Ouija board exactly. It's like a spirit board, and I always use a board because I don't trust anything. If you sit down and stuff starts coming into your head, like a voice coming, whatever, I've seen too many attached entities being too tricky and too clever to trust that, and I've got my own methods for making sure that I'm clear and clean, and anybody who's around me is clear and clean, and we kind of, put those things into practice and have been doing so for years and years. I don't want to do anything like that, and I don't like being, I think it's wrong, basically wrong, for a person to go unconscious or to dissociate in some way for something else to use their sensorium. A lot of people will disagree with me on that. I know they do and have, because I've been attacked viciously by many of them. But I think it's basically wrong. I think that whenever you encounter a phenomenon in this world, you should be in your full possession of your senses so that you can observe, assess, and evaluate it and make a decision about it, whether it's acceptable or whether it's not. Choose right or wrong. It's really simple. When you are dissociated, you are not in a position to make those kinds of observations, assessments, evaluations, and judgments. You don't know. And of course, many entities can make you feel really good. Their interface with your sensorium, with your spirit, your soul, whatever it is they're doing, can make you feel really good because they can trigger all kinds of brain chemicals that make your brain feel good. And in fact, there's something comparable between that and psychopathy. So we published this website, came under attack, and then it was tolerable, I think. But then we were learning a lot. I was learning a lot about these people because I was really observing them. I couldn't believe people acted like this. I mean, it was like the same feeling I had when I read the book about World War II. How can people behave like this? And they group up in gangs. It was really bizarre, and there was some kind of a law that seemed to control that. So I didn't know what it was, but I kept researching. I kept reading, and I mean, my reading of psychological materials at this point really amped up because I was trying to understand how people's brains could behave this way. I mean, this is not something. I had studied a lot of psychology, but I hadn't really studied abnormal psychology. So now I was going deeply into abnormal psychology, and this was back in 2001. And, so 2001, 2002, my husband and I went to an algebra conference in Tennessee, and while we were there, he was spending the days in the lectures and the seminars and so forth at a conference, hanging out with other scientists and mathematicians. This is a mathematics conference. And I was in this hotel, and I had 3 of my kids with me. And we needed to find something to do, so, we ended up watching television. Now, we didn't watch television at home. We very rarely watched television. We had a VCR at the time, and, approved movies were allowed to be watched in the house, but we didn't really watch television. I didn't have cable, and I didn't have any antennas or anything like that at the time. So here I was watching cable television, news, CNN, ABC, NBC. I mean, because the programs were so awful and juvenile, I couldn't bear to watch them, so I ended up watching news. And I was watching this build up to the Iraq War. And I was watching George Bush, Saddam Hussein, and the various diplomatic persons and the various persons from other countries. I mean, I was watching everything. Boom, 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 boom. And here comes my memory. George Bush and his administration would say, you've got weapons of mass destruction. And Saddam Hussein would say, I don't have weapons of mass destruction. Come and inspect. And George Bush would say, I'm going to come and inspect. So I would say, come and inspect. And then George Bush would say, you're not letting us inspect. And I'm saying, wait a minute. They said come and inspect. This kind of thing. So that there was like a real conflict of what was going on. And I said, but people aren't remembering from one day to the next what George Bush has said and what he hasn't said. So I determined at that point to start keeping track of this because I felt confident that after 9/11 that this was the beginning of the setting up of the dominoes for everything to collapse. I knew that on 9/11. And so I decided I was going to keep track of it. And I decided to create a little additional webpage in addition to the one I had on paranormal. And this was about just news, real world news. And I called it Signs of the Times because I felt that these were signs of the times. They were like from the Matthew chapter 24, the signs of the times of the end. although I didn't think it was going to be the end of the world in the biblical sense, I felt like there was going to be some kind of catastrophe. So I started keeping this and exposing Bush and his gang for their, blatant hypocrisy, lies, propaganda, so forth. And I started picking up other items, weather type items, geological items, like earthquakes and that sort of thing. And it was really an interesting process because, when I would do each day's thing, I would say, now, George Bush said today this, but remember back on, and I would link back to 5 days ago when he said something exactly the opposite. I said, he said that there. Now, what is wrong with this man? And I started analyzing George Bush and some of the neocons. And I realized that they fit the profile of psychopathy because that was what I was studying in the background. And the way they use language, because the use of language is very important in the study of psychopathy and other types of abnormal psychology, because the mind expresses itself through words, and you can tell a lot about the landscape in a person's head by how they use words and what words they use. So I was exposing this, and I was quoting from the experts on the topic in relation to what they were saying and what they were doing, putting it side by side. Okay, here's George Bush, he's acting this way, blah, 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 here's Dick Cheney, he says and acting, and here's what the expert says, blah, 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 and this is something we really got to watch out, psychopathy. And as soon as I did that, the first day I did that, I think it was like October 22nd of 2002, and not long after, our dog was poisoned. A dead cat was left at our front door. Our names and addresses were posted on the internet in a discussion group, and people were told to go out and take care of us. People were talking about burning our house down around us. And we got written death threats in the mail. I still pretty much, I think I still got it up. Got an article about it with a scan of the materials and a blow-by-blow account of the events. And at this point also, my husband was working for DARPA. He was working on nuclear material scanning devices and a subcontractor for DARPA. And he didn't like it because we had the strong feeling that this was, with this warmongering going on, beating the war drums in the background, and somehow, and they were trying to accelerate his naturalization so he could have a security clearance. And actually, that kind of made us feel a little bit leery. The fact that they wanted to get this done so they could suck him into their black hole of black projects. And that, along with the threats and stuff going on in the background, and so we decided, that's it, we're leaving. So we talked about where to go, and what to do, and we decided to go to France because France is where he had a lot of colleagues that he worked well with, and he'd spent a lot of years working in France, and he wrote, kind of a famous book with a French co-author from Marseille. And also, a big plus for France getting chosen was because they refused to join the coalition of the deluded in attacking Iraq. I say, well, if the French can see through that nonsense, that's where I want to be. People who can think. Well, sometimes, yeah. So that's where we ended up. And we were here, and it was long about 2004 or 5. And by this time, of course, the invasion of Iraq had taken place, and everything was, just really awful as far as I could see. People were being killed. It just that horrible mess where they went over there based on no evidence whatsoever and started just killing civilians, shock and awe, just bombing them back to the Stone Age. And I was just sick and disgusted by the whole thing. So I was writing articles, and by this time our Signs of the Time had become a real project, and other people were involved, and we got our own programmers who programmed the software for our portal and did everything, made it easy so people from around the world can, input and comment on articles. So it's like it's a global project. We have editors all around the world.
You're using words like psychopathy. So was that part of your vocabulary before you came across
No,
political ponerology, or when did that come in? Because those are such powerful words. And I love it, by the way, that since childhood you were also interested in the reality of evil, which most people completely ignore.
yeah,
You know why we have evil? Because we don't have good thoughts.
not necessarily. Don't blame it on yourself. It's not always the case. Yeah, don't blame why evil is because we don't have good thoughts. That's not it. There's a lot more to it than that. A lot. But
Mm-hmm.
no, I started studying psychopathy when we were being attacked, starting in 2001. And that was only because I began studying abnormal psychology, and that was only because these people were behaving in a way that was not normal, and I needed to have answers. I mean, I need to understand things.
Mm-hmm.
And the word understand is really an interesting word because it means stand, under where you stand, your basis, your foundation, In other words, if I don't understand something, I feel like I'm in quicksand. It's just a characteristic of my nature. I need very powerfully to understand something. And understanding, of course, also involves knowing whether it's true or not, which is what is true or not. So I began studying and writing articles about it, and that's why I said I started comparing George Bush and the neocons and a lot of other things going on to psychopathy, and began, comparing and quoting, and that's when the serious attacks began. So I continued after we moved to France writing articles about it, and I wrote some really extensive articles, and I wrote some articles that really brought me under some real heavy heat. I mean, even at one point, somebody cut a hole in our fence. They, messed with my car here in France. I was being followed and photographed when I went to the Thursday farmers market, to buy vegetables, and all kinds of weird things were going on, and it really was unpleasant, uncomfortable for a long time. I never went anywhere alone. I stopped driving because I didn't go anywhere alone because there was always the concern that somebody would, come, and that sort of thing does happen, and I knew it happened. I did the research. So I was publishing these articles about politics and psychopathy and politicians being psychopaths. And one day I got an email, and it was from a Polish guy, and he said, I read your article with great interest, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, hold on. I will tell you exactly what he said. I probably have the email. If you can give me a second, AND. There it is. I have a lot of emails. He said, Andrew from Poland, dear ladies and gentlemen, I have got your special research project on psychopathy by my computer. You are doing a most important and valuable work for the future of nations. Let me also pass to you my congratulations. I am a very aged clinical psychologist. 40 years ago, I took part in a conspirated investigation of the real nature of psychopathology of this macrosocial phenomena, until now called communism. The other searchers were the scientists of an older generation who are now passed away. The profound study of the nature of psychopathies, which played the essential and inspirational part of this macrosocial psychopathological phenomenon and distinguishing them from other mental anomalies, appeared to be a preparation necessary for understanding the entire nature of the phenomenon. The large part of the work you are doing now was done at these times. So he was saying I was basically replicating what they had done. I was trying to figure it out. The work of Hervey Cleckley is known to me too. Therefore, I am still able to provide you with a most valuable scientific matter useful for your purposes. A Xerox copy of my book you may find in the Library of Congress and some university and public libraries in the U.S. It is Andrew M. Lobachevsky, Political Ponerology, a science on the nature of evil adjusted for political purposes. Be so kind and contact me too. I may mail a copy to you. Very truly yours, Andrew M. Lobachevsky. Yeah, that was on 28th of October, 2005. And the last email I got from him was on the 21st of July, 2007. And then I didn't hear from him for quite a while. And he passed away, I believe, in 2008, late 2007, no, 2008. No, September 2007. He went to the hospital in September due to an infection, and over the course of 2 months, he gradually became weaker and weaker, and finally his organs began to fail, and he passed away. So it must have been November.
Did you speak with him in the time after he emailed you? Did you come into personal contact? I read a really interesting interview in sought.net,
Yeah,
which is
that's
yours, and I thought that was you with him.
it is. That's Signs of the Times. We reduced Signs of the Times to SOT because it just was easier and a little less loaded with religious overtones kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yes, we did, and we flew him out here to stay with us for a period, and we enjoyed him very, very much. And he would get up early in the morning and go out and hunt for mushrooms and bring them in and fry them for breakfast. So it was really nice. And some of us also went to Poland to visit with him there. So it was, it was very sad. And when we took him back to the airport, when he went home after his visit here, I just had the feeling I would never see him again. And I hugged him and I was crying, and it was very, very sad. So, and as it turned out, it was true. But anyhow, when he sent me his book, and I started reading it, and it was like a copy produced by a printer shop, And I was reading it in the bed, and I was just staggered by what I was reading. And I said, this is the key. Because I was, I mentioned a while ago how these people would get together, and there would be like groups, gangs, and understanding how this happened, how they coalesced, what held them together, the kinds of things that you just can't understand. And he had the answers for it, because the answer is that there are various types of psychopaths, first of all, and there are other types of aberrant psychologies, different types of personality disorders, and they interlock together in certain ways. Sometimes they overlap and they interlock, and they function in certain ways. Certain types are always the leader, certain types are always the seconds in command, certain types are always the followers, certain types are always the ones that do the dirty work and so forth, and they're really vicious and have no whatever. And it was just absolutely, utterly fascinating. So we had already started our publishing company back in 2001 or 2002, and we've been publishing our own books because I just came to the conclusion, that nobody is going to let me publish a book the way I write it, because they're going to edit the heck out of me, and I will not be edited. I'll be edited by people who know and understand my work, but I will not have material cut out that is important. And so I said, well, we can publish this. And I said, but it really needs to be edited. The translation was very academically accurate, but extremely difficult to read. And it's still in that, even when I got done with it, because I had to deal with Andrew's feelings about what he was writing. And so I made some suggestions. I did some things, but there were other things that he was, no, it has to be that way because that's academically accurate. And so I had to deal with his feelings, and I did the best I could with, getting it into understandable condition and getting it published. There's a new edition that I think is a little bit easier to read that Harrison, one of our editors, has worked on it and done a new edition. So I think that's probably better. But still, what is more true to the manuscript as I received it is the one that I wrote the foreword to. So, and also if you consider the fact that I have a bizarre reputation because I am considered to be a historian of the weird, somebody who engages in not only ancient history, but also in research into UFOs and the paranormal and real hard politics and so forth. So I have this kind of a reputation as a historian of the weird. So maybe it wasn't such a good idea for me to write the foreword to the book because that would make people say, they go look me up on the internet, oh, she's into the paranormal, because so many people just do that right away. So it's better now because Harrison did a nice editing job. A respected psychologist wrote the new introduction, and, it's not being tarnished by my reputation of a dabbler in the paranormal. So that's probably better for his book. But in any event, I was so powerfully moved by it that, I wrote that introduction the way I wrote it. And I used, Martha Stout's description of the psychopathy because it was like one of the, I thought was one of the hardest hitting descriptions I'd ever read when she talks about, you can do this, and absolutely no conscience. That is really hard for people to understand. But and so I was the one, I'm pretty sure, I was the one who started referring to the current ruling class, or the then ruling class, as psychological deviants, psychopaths, and other types of deviants. And now, and that was back in 2002, in October 2002. And now it has become common currency. People are talking about it everywhere. It's being talked about on podcasts, on news shows, and all kinds of things. So, so I think that it happens, and it happens the way it happens, and it's necessary for people to be educated and become aware of what's going on, and that's kind of where we are, and that's how it all happened. But along the way, I wrote these 16 books. My last book was kind of like a lifelong ambition. It's called From Paul to Mark, Paleo-Christianity, and it's about Jesus, what is true. And I think people might be really surprised because this is really hard research. There's nothing paranormal in there. This is hard, and I had the help of some eminent biblical scholars in the working out and writing of this book. And it's almost 700 pages, but I have detailed everything that can possibly be known about Jesus in that book, and all the points of view of the various people, and I think I found the solution, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to read the book. It's really, it's really good work. I worked on that for 10 years. Really, really slaved. And it's like I would tell other people, I love doing research. Mm-hmm. I hate writing. For me, writing is agonizing. It's torture. It's just torture. So that's the story, and we're up to date.
It's torture, but you spent enough torture time to get 700 pages there I'm so tempted to give a tiny little bit of the conclusion of, and I won't. I'm going to honor your thing that I won't tell the core of from Paul to Mark. I won't tell that. So I will go with your thing about let people read it. Let people discover it, because in some ways you have an answer, if people only would think right, to some core issues of our time. Like, what will undo some core conflicts if this could be gotten through? And it's not about pushing on where the current pushing goes, as in questioning about the Quran. It's totally different from that. Incredibly interesting. And so I won't tell people what you say, because that would be cheating, wouldn't it? It would be defeating the purpose of this interview. I love your passion for truth. And I love it that you have not been willing to go only with a tiny passion for truth. I want truth about water. I want truth about, oh, well, no, that's paranormal. We don't do that because that's outside our boundaries. You've gone, I have a question. How do I find out what's really going on? And I know another of the things about you is that even though you've come to an incredible amount of truth that so many people don't approach, like that evil exists, you absolutely believe that. And I totally agree with you. But you haven't said, I know exactly what evil is. I know the exact parameters of everything. Here is the paranormal in 3 paragraphs. There is so much that you leave for other people to keep exploring. So your explorations are both huge and wide-ranging, and they leave space for other people. So I want to, congratulations on being who you are. And thank you for this interview.
You are most welcome, and I thank you for appreciating the truth, because the truth is beauty. Truth is love. If you don't have truth, you don't have anything of love. And you get to the truth by acquiring knowledge. Anybody who's not acquiring knowledge in some way, and there are many ways to acquire knowledge and many levels, and everybody's different and individual. I just happen to be this particular type of person, and I want to acquire it, and then I want to give it away. This to you. Let me give this to you. Because, just about everything I have ever written is available for free on my website. I mean, yes, we make a living, sort of, by selling books. But I don't want the cost of a book to come between anybody and their ability to find out what's really going on. And I have done the heavy lifting. My speed reading brain has gone through the material. I have, extracted the important parts, lined them up, laid them out, juxtaposed them against other important parts from other people, from many people, so that the reader can go and they can get like the Reader's Digest condensed version of the truth of the universe, right there. But it's still going to take some work. It's still 16 books worth, and one of those books is 700 pages long. But imagine the library I have gone through to extract and distill that data. If somebody reads my book, they have read a library. They know what's in a library of books, because I will tell them, and I quote it directly. Here is the text. This is what it says. I'm not just telling you what it says. I am giving it to you. Here it is. People can make their own decisions. Did my analysis of the text, suit them, or do they have one that's better? It's there. It's available for them to make up their own mind. I'll say, here's the text. Here's how I see it. Here's how he sees it. Da, da, da. It's still a little open, it's still a little wobbly, but, we can go with this as a hypothesis for the moment. Yeah. So if you have knowledge, you can acquire some truth. And if you have truth, you can truly know love. And that's true about even humans and individuals. How can you love somebody you don't know? To know them is to love them, to know, the old 50s song. So that's it.
Yes. And I see you've lived with passion. If there's anything I see that people can take, it's you've lived a full life. You are leading a full life. You're not doing the research out of, oh, I got to do this awful thing. It's that it has to do with full living. And of what I see about so many people around, the people who swallow the narrative, they're not leading full lives. They're not questioning. They're not passionate. What I see with you is questioning, passionate, reaching, and an incredible fullness. And I think that this is how we are meant to be living. We are meant to be living full, flourishing lives. And so thank you for talking with me and for also living such an amazing life.
Thank you. Have a great day and go read something.
Yes.